The bell rang at exactly 10:10 a.m., sharp enough to cut through the chatter like a blade. Before we get into this, I want you to do one quick thing for me. Drop a comment with where you're watching from right now, your city, your country, even if you're just listening in the background. Because stories like this hit different when you realize how many people have lived some version of it. Keisha Warren noticed the bell because Keisha noticed everything. Not in a paranoid way, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, disciplined way that came from practice. She noticed when a teacher smiled at one student and tightened their mouth at another. She noticed when rules were enforced loudly for some people and whispered away for others. She noticed when authority was more interested in being obeyed than being fair. Room 214 sat on the second floor of Brookhaven High, a school that liked calling itself diverse on brochures and traditional in meetings. The window beside Keisha's desk gave her a clear view of the football field and the bleachers where the popular kids sat during pep rallies. It was the kind of view that made freedom look close enough to touch. Inside the classroom, freedom was always conditional. Keisha sat in the third row, not too close to the front, not far enough to disappear. Her notebook was centered on the desk, pen aligned along the margin, paper clean and ready. People called her quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that came from fear. It was the kind that came from restraint. You learn restraint when you grow up in a house where someone explains to you gently but repeatedly that the world doesn't always punish wrong the way it should. You learn it when your father is a federal judge and he teaches you, without trying to scare you, that truth needs proof if it's going to survive a room full of confident liars. Judge Daniel Warren never raised his voice at home. He didn't need to. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully, as if each sentence could become a record. Keisha had inherited that. At the front of room 214 stood Mr. Evan Grant, social studies, mid-40s, the kind of man whose shirts were always pressed too crisp, whose shoes never scuffed, whose voice carried a certainty that made students sit up straighter before they even knew why. He clapped once. "Phones away," he said. "We're starting." The class moved quickly, a soft rustle of backpacks and pockets. Everyone knew how Mr. Grant ran his room. The rules were simple: listen, comply, don't question. He called it discipline. Some students called it control. Keisha finished writing the date at the top of her page before setting her pen down. Mr. Grant's eyes flicked to her hand. He always noticed Keisha. "Miss Warren," he said, voice clipped like he'd been waiting for this moment all morning. "We've talked about readiness." Keisha looked up calmly. "Yes, sir. My notes are complete." A few students shifted. They'd seen this exchange before. It never turned into anything big, but it always left the air slightly colder. Mr. Grant smiled, thin and tight. "Confidence is admirable, but attitude is not." Keisha didn't respond. That was her first mistake in his eyes. Silence can feel like disrespect to people who need you to perform submission. He turned back to the board and began the lesson like nothing had happened. Today's topic: constitutional amendments, civil rights, equal protection under the law. Big words, important words. Words that sounded clean when spoken by someone who'd never needed them to protect his own dignity. Keisha listened. She took notes. Her handwriting stayed steady even when Mr. Grant's tone sharpened and softened the way it did when he was trying to prove something to himself. She learned to separate information from the person delivering it. But she also learned to notice patterns, and Mr. Grant had one. He didn't correct everyone the same way. He didn't scrutinize everyone the same way. And he didn't look at Keisha the same way he looked at the white girls who wore skirts higher than policy allowed, or the boys whose pants hung low enough to show underwear, or the athletes who strolled in late with no consequence except a joke and warning. Keisha's violations were always invisible until he decided they weren't. About 20 minutes into the period, Mr. Grant stopped mid-sentence. His eyes dropped toward Keisha's desk, then moved slowly up, taking in her outfit as if he was searching for a reason. Then his gaze narrowed. "Stand up," he said. The command sliced through the room.
A couple of students glanced at each other. One girl's eyebrows rose like she already knew what was coming. Keisha paused, not out of fear, but calculation, then stood. "Yes, sir?" "What exactly do you think you're wearing today?" Mr. Grant asked. A hush fell. Not respectful hush, uneasy hush. Keisha glanced down at herself. Navy blue dress, knee-length, long sleeves, flat shoes, modest neckline. It was the kind of outfit nobody would notice in the hallway. It was objectively safe. "The same thing I wore last week," she said evenly. "It met dress code standards." Mr. Grant stepped closer, his shoes clicking softly on the tile. Dress code violations aren't always about measurements. They're about distraction. Somewhere behind Keisha, a boy muttered, "How is that distracting?" Mr. Grant snapped his head toward the back. "Silence." The room froze again. Then he turned to Keisha with a look that felt like a decision. "You young ladies like to test boundaries, then act shocked when consequences follow. If you've ever been singled out in front of a room and you could feel people watching to see how you'll react, you know what that pressure does. It makes your throat tighten. It makes your hands go cold. It makes you think about survival more than fairness." Keisha reached into her backpack slowly and pulled out the student handbook. It wasn't crumpled. It wasn't random. It was organized, tabbed, highlighted in careful lines. She opened it to a marked page without looking down for long. Section 4, subsection B. This outfit is permitted. For a second, Mr. Grant stared at the book like it offended him. Then his expression changed. Not anger. Something colder. Something that said, "You don't get to be this prepared." "Come to the front," he said. Keisha obeyed. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she kept her shoulders level. Her heart beat steadily, not because she wasn't scared, but because fear wasn't new. The new part was the escalation. Her father's voice appeared in her mind the way it did whenever she felt trapped. "Sometimes the rules won't protect you. That's when you document everything." Mr. Grant took the handbook from her without asking. He didn't open it, didn't read the highlighted lines. He dropped it onto the desk like it was meaningless. "You don't challenge authority. You submit to it." Keisha's mouth went dry. "Respectfully," she began. He cut her off with a sharp tilt of his head. "No, not respectfully. Not today." Then he reached out. His fingers gripped the fabric at the front seam of her dress, near where it lay flat and harmless. Keisha's breath caught. The sound was sudden, violent. A sharp rip tore through the room. Gasps followed instantly. A chair scraped. Someone's phone hit the floor with a hollow clack. Mr. Grant stepped back, breathing hard like he'd just won something. There, problem resolved. For a second, Keisha couldn't hear anything but the blood in her ears. The classroom blurred at the edges. She felt heat rush into her face, not because of the cold air, but because humiliation has its own temperature. She did not look down. She did not give him that satisfaction. She reached behind herself, grabbed the cardigan from her chair, and tied it around her waist with hands that only trembled once. Mr. Grant watched, waiting. He expected tears, a breakdown, a plea, shame. He expected the moment where her dignity would collapse and prove his power. Keisha didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She bent down, picked up her notebook, and straightened her shoulders. Her silence hit the room like a second bell.
Even the students who didn't like her looked unsettled, because this wasn't normal discipline. This wasn't a dress code correction. This was something else, something too ugly to pretend away. Keisha looked past Mr. Grant to the clock above the whiteboard, 8:47 a.m., exactly when her father said he'd be in the building today. She hadn't known why he'd said it. He rarely explained his schedule. He didn't bring his work home, but she remembered the time anyway. Mr. Grant's voice rose, brittle. "Sit down, we're continuing the lesson." Keisha returned to her desk without a word. She sat. She opened her notebook. She wrote, 8:45 a.m., physical contact, dress code misapplied, public humiliation, witnesses, entire class. If you're still here with me, I want you to keep listening closely, because this is the moment most people think the story ends. They think the humiliation is the climax, but humiliation
is rarely the end. It's usually the beginning of the cover-up. The bell rang and the class surged into motion like a shaken jar. Students grabbed their bags, eyes flicking toward Keisha and away again. A few lingered like they wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Most left quickly because proximity to trouble feels dangerous when you're a teenager and you don't have power. Mr. Grant stood at the door, blocking it like a gate. "Miss Warren," he said, low enough that the class wouldn't hear clearly, "you'll remain after." Keisha looked up at him. "No," she said calmly, "I won't." The word did something to his face, a flash of surprise, then resentment. "That wasn't a request. I have an appointment," Keisha replied evenly, "with my parent." Mr. Grant's jaw tightened. For a second, Keisha thought he might grab her arm, but he stepped aside at the last moment. "This isn't over." Keisha walked out. The hallway buzzed like a hornet's nest. Phones were out. Screens glowed. Whispers chased her. Did he really? That was insane. I would have swung. Keisha didn't answer anyone. She moved quickly into the girls' restroom and locked herself into the last stall. Only then did her hands begin to shake for real. She pressed her palms against her thighs and forced herself to breathe. Slow in, slower out. It wasn't about pretending she wasn't hurt. It was about staying functional long enough to protect herself. She opened her backpack. Inside was a manila folder, edges worn from being carried every day. The label was written neatly in black ink, "Modern Civil Rights, Final Project." She flipped to the back and added a new page. Incident, number 7. Location, room 214. Perpetrator, Evan Grant. Escalation, physical. Witnesses, 28. She paused and wrote one more line. Response, remain silent. Documented. Keisha closed the folder, slid it back into her bag, and washed her hands like she could rinse the moment off her skin. By lunchtime, Mr. Grant had already moved. He walked into the assistant principal's office with the confidence of someone who believed his version of the story would become the official one simply because he said it first. She was defiant. She challenged my authority in front of the class. This wasn't about the dress. It was about her attitude. The assistant principal, Miss Carlyle, listened with her lips pressed together. She was the kind of administrator who wanted problems to disappear, not because she was cruel, but because the system rewarded avoidance. "Did you touch the student?" she asked carefully. Mr. Grant didn't hesitate. She moved suddenly. The tear was accidental. A lie, delivered with the smoothness of practice. Miss Carlyle exhaled. "We'll need to document this." Mr. Grant nodded like that was all he wanted. By the end of the day, an email went out to staff. Subject, classroom incident, room 214. Summary, student non-compliance during dress code enforcement, matter under review. No mention of force, no mention of witnesses, no mention of humiliation. Keisha read the email in the library, sitting alone at a table where the light from the window fell across her hands. She stared at the words and felt something harden inside her. Not anger, certainty. This was the pivot, the moment the system chose a side. Keisha opened her phone and forwarded the email to one contact.
Dad. At the courthouse, Judge Daniel Warren read it once, then again. He didn't call the school. He didn't fire off an emotional message. He picked up the phone and dialed his clerk. "Clear my afternoon," he said calmly, "and pull every complaint involving Brookhaven High in the last 10 years. Anything tied to discrimination, dress code enforcement, or teacher misconduct." A pause. "And I want the personnel history on Evan Grant. Everything. Even the parts they think are buried." He ended the call and stared out at the city, jaw set. He had raised his daughter to be honest. Now, he would make sure honesty wasn't punished. That night, Keisha sat at the kitchen table with her folder open, notebook beside it. Her father sat across from her, listening without interruption while she described every detail. His face stayed controlled, but his eyes sharpened with each sentence, as if he was seeing the incident not as a parent, but as a pattern. When she finished, he asked one question. "Do you want me to intervene tomorrow?" Keisha swallowed. "No," she said, "not yet." Judge Warren watched her carefully. "Why?" "Because if you step in too soon," she said, They'll say I used you. They'll make it about you, not about what he did. The judge nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then we build the record, and we let them show exactly who they are. Keisha looked down at her notebook. She wrote one more line beneath incident number 7. Let them. If you've made it this far, I need you to stay with me for batch 2, because this is where most people get it wrong. They think the truth automatically wins once it's spoken, but in places like Brookhaven High, truth doesn't win because it's true. It wins because it's documented. And tomorrow, the school was going to teach Keisha exactly how far it would go to protect a man like Evan Grant.
The next morning, Brookhaven High looked the same from the outside. Same brick walls, same flags snapping weakly in the wind, same students spilling through the entrance like nothing had happened in room 214. But inside, the air felt different. Keisha felt it the moment she stepped into the hallway. People were looking at her like she had changed the temperature of the building. Some students glanced and looked away fast as if eye contact could make them responsible. Others stared like they were trying to decide which version of the story they believed, because there were already versions. By first period, the rumor wasn't that Mr. Grant ripped her dress. The rumor was that Keisha talked back. By second period, the rumor was that Keisha set him up. By lunch, the rumor had evolved into something uglier, whispered with the excitement people get when they're glad the fire isn't burning their house. Keisha walked past a group of girls near the lockers and heard the word dramatic said like a verdict. She kept walking. Her phone buzzed twice before she reached homeroom. A private number the first time, no message. Then a text from someone saved as Talia. "You okay?" Keisha stared at it a second. Talia was the closest thing Keisha had to a friend in that class. Not a best friend, not the kind you tell everything, but the kind who would sit beside you when the room got loud and you didn't want to be alone. Keisha typed back, "I'm here." Before she could put the phone away, another message came through. "My mom says they're saying you might get suspended. Please be careful." Keisha read it twice. Be careful. As if she was the one who had torn fabric with his hands. If you've ever noticed how quickly people start giving you advice on how to survive injustice instead of advice on how to stop it, you know what that sentence really meant. It meant, protect yourself, but don't make the rest of us uncomfortable. Keisha sat through homeroom with a notebook open, pen moving. She didn't write schoolwork. She wrote names. She wrote phrases. She wrote how the teacher who had smiled at her yesterday didn't smile today. She wrote how the security guard who always nodded suddenly looked past her like she wasn't there. By second period, an announcement came over the loudspeaker. "Keisha Warren, please report to guidance." A few heads turned. Keisha didn't react outwardly. She closed the notebook, slid it into a bag, and walked through the hallway with a steady pace that didn't match how her stomach felt. The guidance office smelled like lavender and cheap coffee, a combination meant to calm people who were being told to accept things they didn't want. Miss Jansen sat behind her desk with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Keisha," she said warmly, like they were catching up, "thank you for coming." Keisha sat in the chair across from her, posture straight. Miss Jansen folded her hands. "Yesterday was a lot." Keisha waited. "We want to support you," Miss Jansen continued. "We also want to prevent this from becoming something bigger than it needs to be." Keisha felt the sentence land. Something bigger. As if what happened to her was naturally small until she made it inconvenient. "What does support look like?" Keisha asked. Miss Jansen blinked like she hadn't expected a question that direct. "Well," she said, choosing her words, "sometimes the best way to move forward is to take a day or two away from school. Rest, reset." "I'm not sick," Keisha replied. "I didn't say you were," Miss Jansen said quickly. "I'm just saying you might need space, and sometimes when emotions are high, misunderstandings happen." Keisha's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. "Was it a misunderstanding when he grabbed my dress?" Keisha asked. Miss Jansen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then recovered. "Mr. Grant has stated it was accidental." Keisha nodded slowly, like she was listening. Inside, she felt something settle. There it was, the official story. Miss Jansen leaned forward. Keisha, I've worked here a long time. I've seen situations like this spiral. People get hurt. Reputations get damaged. Keisha's voice stayed quiet. Mine already did. Miss Jansen sighed, as if Keisha was being difficult. What I mean is, if you'd be willing to write a statement acknowledging there may have been confusion, it would help everyone move on. Help everyone. Not help Keisha. Help the building. Help the adults. Help the narrative return to normal. Keisha stood. No. Miss Jansen looked startled. Keisha. No. Keisha repeated calmly. I won't lie so people feel comfortable. For a moment, the counselor's face hardened. Then she softened again, switching back to gentle. Think about it, she said. Sometimes it's better to be practical than right. Keisha walked out without answering. In the hallway, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her father. Call me when you can. Keisha stared at the text for a moment, then typed back. After school. She didn't want to call him from the hallway where anyone could listen, twist, interpret. Keisha had learned that privacy was a form of protection. By lunchtime, the social punishment began. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody threw food. Nobody shouted names. That would have been too obvious. It was quieter than that. People moved their trays away when she sat. A group at the next table laughed a little too loud when she opened her notebook. Someone walked by and said, "Somebody thinks she's famous now," under their breath. Keisha kept eating, even though the food tasted like paper. Then Talia appeared, tray in hand, hovering. Can I sit? Talia asked softly. Keisha nodded. Talia sat down, looked around like she didn't want anyone to see her, then leaned in. My mom said Mr. Grant's cousin is on the school board, and Miss Carlisle is close with him. They're not going to let him go down. Keisha didn't respond right away. Talia's voice trembled. People are saying you did this on purpose. Keisha asked, do you believe him? Talia hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any answer could. Keisha's throat tightened. Talia looked down at her tray. I don't know what to believe. He's a teacher. You're, a kid, a black girl, a target. Keisha nodded once, like she accepted the reality of what Talia couldn't say out loud. Talia rushed on, desperate to fix the moment. I'm not saying I think you're lying. I'm just saying it's complicated. Keisha's voice stayed level. It's not complicated. Talia's eyes flicked up. Keisha continued, quieter now. He grabbed my dress. He tore it. That part isn't complicated. Talia swallowed. Then she did the thing Keisha didn't expect. She slid her phone across the table. I recorded some of it, Talia whispered. Keisha froze for half a second. The cafeteria noise blurred. You recorded it, Keisha repeated, voice barely above a breath. Talia nodded quickly. I didn't know what to do. Everyone was freaking out. I hit record. But, Keisha, I can't give it to you. Keisha stared at her. Talia's eyes were wet. My mom said if I get involved, it'll ruin me. She said colleges don't like drama. She said the school will punish me. Keisha felt a sharp sting behind her eyes, but she didn't let it show. So you recorded my humiliation, and you're going to keep it. Talia's face tightened. I'm sorry. Keisha looked at the phone, then back at Talia. Delete it, Keisha said. Talia's face tightened. I can't.
Keisha's voice didn't change. Then don't call yourself my friend. Talia's mouth opened, then closed. She pulled her phone back like it burned. Keisha returned to her food, even though her hands were shaking under the table. If you're listening, and you've ever been betrayed by someone who said they cared about you but cared more about their comfort, stay with me, because what happens next is where Keisha stops expecting people to do the right thing voluntarily. After lunch, Keisha was called to the assistant principal's office. Miss Carlisle sat behind her desk with a folder open, expression carefully neutral. Mr. Grant was there too. He stood near the window, arms crossed, looking like he belonged in that room more than Keisha did. Keisha, Miss Carlisle began, thank you for coming. This is an informal meeting. Keisha looked at the folder. It doesn't look informal. Miss Carlisle ignored that. Mr. Grant has filed a report stating that during dress code enforcement, you became disruptive, you moved aggressively, and your clothing tore accidentally. Keisha's mouth went dry. Mr. Grant spoke smoothly.
I tried to handle it respectfully. She escalated. Keisha looked at him. You tore my dress. Mr. Grant shook his head with practiced disappointment. That's not what happened. Miss Carlisle held up a hand. Keisha, this is your chance to be honest. If you admit there was confusion, we can resolve this with minimal consequences. Keisha stared at her. Minimal consequences? For who? Are you asking me to lie? Keisha asked. Miss Carlisle's eyes hardened slightly. I'm asking you to acknowledge your role. My role was standing there, Keisha replied. Mr. Grant's voice sharpened. You challenged me in front of the class. You threw a handbook at my desk like you were my equal. Keisha blinked slowly. I am your equal. The words hung in the air like a slap. Miss Carlisle's tone turned colder. Keisha, you are a student. Keisha nodded once, and he is an adult who put his hands on me. Miss Carlisle closed the folder with a soft thud. We are scheduling a hearing, she said, a student conduct review. Keisha's stomach tightened. Miss Carlisle continued, this will remain internal, closed session, limited witnesses, no phones. Mr. Grant looked pleased. Keisha understood why. They wanted a room without cameras, a room where only the official story could survive. Keisha stood. I want my parent notified. Miss Carlisle smiled tightly. Of course. Keisha walked out. In the hallway, she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She walked straight to the nearest bathroom, locked herself into a stall, and let her breath come out in a silent, trembling rush. Not because she regretted what she said, because she realized the school wasn't trying to find truth. It was trying to crush her into agreement. She pulled out her manila folder and flipped to the back. Incident number 7. She added new lines. Next day, guidance pressured to move on. Friend recorded video, refused to share. Assistant principal repeated false report. Hearing scheduled, closed session, no phones. Then she wrote something else. Pattern confirmed. Institution protects him. After school, Keisha sat in the passenger seat of her father's car, the quiet inside the cabin thick with unsaid things. Judge Warren drove without speaking for 2 full minutes. Then he said, tell me everything. So Keisha did. She told him about the counselor's suggestion to reset. She told him about Miss Carlisle's offer to make it minimal. She told him about Talia recording and refusing to hand it over. Her father's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice stayed controlled. They're building a record, he said quietly. Keisha looked at him. So are we. Judge Warren nodded once. When they got home, he opened a slim folder he'd brought from his office. He slid documents across the kitchen table like cards in a game where the stakes were dignity. Brookhaven has history, he said.
Keisha stared at the pages. Prior complaints, names redacted, dates spanning years, dress code enforcement, attitude problems, disrespect, insubordination, the same language repeated. It was a script. And now Keisha was in the role they'd written for. Judge Warren tapped one page. This teacher has been warned before. Keisha's throat tightened. Then why is he still there? Her father's eyes met hers. Because most people don't document long enough to make it expensive. Keisha swallowed. Judge Warren continued. The hearing they're scheduling is designed to isolate you, make you feel small, make you emotional, make you say something they can use. Keisha nodded. Her father slid a notepad toward her. We don't give them emotion, we give them record. Keisha picked up her pen. That evening, Keisha did something she'd never done before. She messaged classmates directly, not to gossip, not to plead, to ask for facts. If you saw what happened, write what you saw, just what you saw, date it, sign it. Some people didn't reply. Some replied with fear. I don't want trouble. Some replied with vague sympathy. Sorry that happened. But a few replied with something that surprised her. All right. Within 2 days, Keisha had 5 witness statements, then 9, then 12. Students who had stayed silent in class but felt braver behind a screen. Students whose parents were furious. Students who didn't like Keisha but hated what Mr. Grant had done even more. Keisha printed each statement, placed it in her folder, and made copies. She also typed a clean timeline, dates and times lined up like evidence in a case file. On the morning of the hearing, Keisha dressed carefully, not to be respectable,
not to be unthreatening, but because she refused to give them any extra excuse. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, hair neat, shoulders back. At school, Miss Carlisle met her outside the auditorium doors. "You understand this is confidential," she said. "No recording devices." Keisha nodded. "I understand." Inside, the auditorium was dimmer than usual, curtains drawn slightly, as if they wanted the room to feel private enough to swallow noise. Mr. Grant sat at a table near the front, hands folded, expression calm. Too calm. Administrators sat across from him, papers stacked, pens ready. Keisha sat alone at the student table. Miss Carlisle cleared her throat. "This hearing is to address student misconduct arising from the incident in room 214. Student misconduct. Keisha stared at the wording and felt the familiar steadiness return. They were starting with a lie. Miss Carlisle continued. "Keisha, this is your opportunity to explain your behavior." Keisha stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She opened her folder and began reading the timeline calmly, like she was presenting a project. Because she was. She read dates, prior warnings, exact quotes from Mr. Grant. Miss Carlisle's pen slowed. A vice principal shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Grant leaned forward, impatience flashing. "This is ridiculous. She's twisting events. She planned this. She's trying to destroy my career for attention." Keisha looked at him. Then she reached into her folder and placed a thick stack of papers on the table. Witness statements. The sound they made, paper meeting wood, was louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. Mr. Grant's confidence wavered for the first time. Miss Carlisle stared at the stack like she hadn't expected Keisha to arrive prepared enough to fight back. Keisha didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "These are facts." And that was when the door at the back of the auditorium opened with a soft click. Someone stepped inside. Keisha didn't turn around yet, but she felt the room shift.
The door at the back of the auditorium opened with a soft click. It wasn't loud, but it changed the room anyway. Every head turned at once like a flock reacting to a shadow. A man stepped inside wearing a dark suit that looked too expensive for a school hallway. Not flashy, not dramatic, just clean lines and quiet authority. He didn't rush, he didn't speak. He simply walked down the aisle with the kind of calm that made people instinctively sit up straighter. Keisha didn't move. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She recognized the sound of his steps, the way you recognize a voice you've heard your whole life. Judge Daniel Warren stopped near the back row and took a seat as if he belonged there. Miss Carlisle froze for a half second, then recovered, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir," she said, standing slightly, "this is a closed session." Judge Warren looked at her, polite but unreadable. "I'm here as her parent," he said calmly. "You notified me. I arrived." Miss Carlisle blinked. "Yes, but you expected me to stay outside," Judge Warren finished for her, voice still level. "I understand." Mr. Grant's head tilted. He didn't recognize the judge yet, not fully. He only recognized the problem, an adult witness with composure. Mr. Grant leaned forward, voice controlled but sharper now. "This is a student discipline matter. Parents don't usually sit in." Judge Warren turned his gaze at Mr. Grant with a stillness that made the air feel heavier. "Usually," he repeated softly. Keisha kept her eyes on the table, but she could feel the room rearranging itself around his presence. Administrators who had felt confident 5 minutes ago suddenly looked like they were remembering policies they hadn't read in years. Miss Carlisle cleared her throat. "Keisha," she said, "we are concerned about your pattern of defiance. You challenged a teacher publicly. You refused to stay after class. You are now presenting a stack of accusations in a discipline hearing." Keisha listened without reacting. Miss Carlisle continued, "This behavior creates disruption. Even if there was confusion in the moment, you escalated it by gathering statements." Keisha's voice stayed steady. "I documented it."
Miss Carlisle leaned forward. "And what outcome are you seeking?" Keisha didn't hesitate. "Accountability." Mr. Grant laughed once, short and bitter.
This is what I mean. She thinks she can run the room. Keisha met his eyes. No, I think you shouldn't be allowed to touch students. A silence followed that felt like someone had shut off a fan. Miss Carlisle's mouth tightened. Keisha, you keep using that word touch. I'm using the correct word, Keisha replied. Mr. Grant's tone turned cold. This is a character attack. She's trying to imply something criminal. Judge Warren's gaze didn't shift. It became potentially criminal when physical force was used, he said. You understand that? Mr. Grant stared at him, something uneasy flickering behind his eyes now. Who are you again? Mr. Grant asked, voice more cautious than before. Judge Warren didn't answer immediately. He reached into his suit jacket, removed a simple card, and placed it on the table in front of Miss Carlisle. The seal caught the light when she looked down. Her face changed. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that comes with suddenly realizing you've been speaking too casually in the presence of someone who can make consequences real. Miss Carlisle's voice went quiet. Your Honor. Mr. Grant's smile vanished. He leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. Judge Warren's tone remained even. Continue, he said, gesturing lightly. I'm listening. Miss Carlisle cleared her throat again, but it didn't fix the tremor that had entered her hands. We can take a brief recess, she said quickly, so we can... No, Keisha said calmly. The room snapped toward her. Keisha continued, voice steady. We're not taking breaks to rewrite what happened. Mr. Grant's face flushed. That's enough. Judge Warren's eyes didn't leave Mr. Grant. It's not enough, he said quietly. Not yet. Miss Carlisle swallowed. Keisha, we need to maintain order. Keisha nodded toward the witness statements. Order doesn't mean silence. Something about that sentence shifted the room again. Even the vice principal, who had been pretending not to take sides, looked down like he didn't want to meet anyone's eyes. Miss Carlisle picked up a pen. Fine, she said, trying to regain control. Keisha, provide your summary of events. Keisha lifted her notebook and read without dramatics. Times, actions, words said by Mr. Grant, how he took the handbook, how he grabbed the fabric, the sound of the rip, the class reaction. She did not add feelings. She did not add interpretations. She stayed with facts, because facts were harder to argue with without sounding cruel. When she finished, Miss Carlisle looked at Mr. Grant. Mr. Grant, she said, your response. Mr. Grant sat up straighter, and for a moment he tried to return to the confident teacher voice, the voice that controlled rooms. This student has been a problem, consistently challenging authority. I instructed her to comply with dress code. She refused. She came to the front with an aggressive posture. When I attempted to guide her, Keisha's voice cut in softly. Guide me. Mr. Grant shot her a look. Yes, guide you. She jerked back. The fabric tore. It was not intentional. Judge Warren's voice was quiet. So you're saying you made contact? Mr. Grant hesitated. I made contact with the clothing. Keisha stared at him. Your fingers were on my dress. Mr. Grant snapped. I was correcting a violation. Judge Warren leaned back slightly. Brookhaven's dress code policy does not authorize staff to tear clothing, he said. Miss Carlisle's cheeks flushed. Of course not. Then why wasn't law enforcement contacted? The question landed heavier than anything else so far. Miss Carlisle blinked. Because there was no crime. Judge Warren's eyes stayed steady. A staff member forcibly tearing a student's clothing in a public classroom while restricting exit could reasonably be construed as assault or harassment depending on jurisdiction and circumstances. At minimum, it's a serious policy violation. Mr. Grant's voice rose. This is outrageous. Judge Warren didn't match the volume. Lower your voice, he said calmly. And Mr. Grant did. Not because he wanted to, because some authority has weight. Miss Carlisle tried to pull the moment back into her control. Your Honor, she said, this is still a school matter. We have procedures. Judge Warren nodded once. Procedures require an unbiased inquiry. He turned his gaze slightly. Who conducted the investigation?
Miss Carlyle hesitated. I reviewed the report. And interviewed witnesses? He asked. Miss Carlyle's silence answered. Judge Warren's tone didn't change. Did you preserve any evidence? He asked. Miss Carlyle looked at Keisha briefly, then away. We issued an email. Judge Warren's eyes narrowed, not angrily, precisely. An email that omitted essential facts, he said. Mr. Grant tried to regain footing. This is a setup, he said. She's using her father to intimidate us. Keisha's voice stayed calm. I didn't need him to intimidate you. I needed you to tell the truth. Mr. Grant's lips curled. You think you're smarter than everyone. Keisha tilted her head slightly. No, I think you're used to people being scared. The vice principal shifted in his seat as if the chair had suddenly become uncomfortable. Miss Carlyle tapped her pen nervously. Keisha, she said, if you continue with this tone. Keisha looked at her. What tone? Miss Carlyle's mouth opened, then closed. She'd used the word tone because it was an old trick. If you can't attack facts, attack the way the facts are spoken. Turn composure into disrespect. Judge Warren watched the exchange and then spoke again. Before this hearing continues, he said, I'd like to introduce additional context. Miss Carlyle blinked. Additional context? Judge Warren reached into a slim folder he'd brought, removed several pages, and placed them gently on the table. They were printed copies, official-looking, neatly organized. Keisha recognized them immediately. Prior complaints. Not just rumors, not hallway stories, formal documents. Miss Carlyle's eyes widened as she scanned the top page. Mr. Grant leaned forward, and for the first time, his hands didn't look steady. Judge Warren's voice stayed even. Brookhaven High has a history of complaints alleging discriminatory enforcement of dress code and punitive discipline for perceived attitude, he said. Many of those complaints involve the same language used in Keisha's case. Miss Carlyle's face tightened. Where did you get these? Judge Warren didn't blink. Public record requests, internal channels, legal archives. Mr. Grant's voice went sharp. This is irrelevant. You're dredging up old nonsense. Judge Warren looked at him. Patterns are not nonsense, he said. Keisha watched Mr. Grant's confidence crumble in small pieces. Not dramatic, but visible, like a crack slowly spreading across glass. Miss Carlyle tried again to reframe. Your Honor, the district has addressed these matters over time. Judge Warren nodded, as if acknowledging a predictable defense. Then you won't mind a thorough review, he said. Miss Carlyle's throat bobbed. We can handle this internally. Judge Warren's tone sharpened just slightly, the way a judge's voice changes when the court needs clarity. You had the opportunity to handle it internally, he said. Instead, you scheduled a closed hearing that framed Keisha as the offender and restricted witness participation. Mr. Grant stood up abruptly, chair legs scraping. This is harassment. I want this stopped. Judge Warren didn't rise. He didn't react with heat. He simply looked up at Mr. Grant. Sit down. And for a half-second, everyone waited to see if Mr. Grant would refuse. Mr. Grant's jaw flexed. Then he sat. If you're still listening, this is a good moment to hit the like button if you want more stories that end with power getting cornered by truth, because what happens next is the part people replay. Miss Carlyle's voice wavered. What exactly are you suggesting, Your Honor? Judge Warren's gaze moved across the administrators, then returned to Miss Carlyle. I'm suggesting you stop treating this as an inconvenience and start treating it as a violation of a student's rights. The word rights landed like a stamp. Mr. Grant's voice turned defensive. This is ridiculous. She's exaggerating. Keisha's eyes stayed on him, then explained the witness statements, she said. Mr. Grant sneered. They're coached. Keisha's voice didn't rise. They're dated, signed, and consistent. Miss Carlyle looked at the stack again, then up at Keisha like she was seeing her differently for the first time. Not as a student she could pressure, as a person who had built something solid. Mr. Grant tried a different tactic, voice turning falsely sympathetic. Keisha, he said,
I'm sorry you felt embarrassed, but you need to understand there are standards. We can't have students coming in dressed however they want. Keisha stared at him, unmoved. You're still not telling the truth. Mr. Grant's smile flickered. I'm telling the truth as I saw it. Keisha nodded slowly. Then we should look at what everyone else saw. Mr. Grant's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Keisha didn't answer immediately, because she didn't know, not yet. But something else was happening outside that auditorium, in the hallway, in the phones of students, in the fear of people who had recorded things they weren't supposed to record. Talia. Keisha's phone buzzed in her pocket. Once. She didn't reach for it immediately. Miss Carlyle glanced at her. No phones, she said sharply, trying to regain control. Keisha held her gaze. Then maybe you shouldn't have tried to make this happen in secret. Judge Warren's eyes shifted slightly, as if he noticed the buzz too, not because he was curious, but because he understood what it could mean. Keisha slowly pulled her phone from her pocket. Miss Carlyle's voice rose. Keisha! Judge Warren's voice stayed calm. Let her check it. Miss Carlyle froze. Keisha looked down. A message from an unknown number. I have it. I'm scared, but I have it.
Tell your dad to check his email. Keisha's breath caught. She didn't need the name. She knew. Her eyes lifted to her father. He had already pulled his phone out, already checking, the way he did when something mattered. Mr. Grant watched him, confused, then suspicious. What is this? He demanded. Judge Warren didn't answer him. Keisha didn't answer him. They didn't know him reassurance. Judge Warren's face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened as he read something on the screen. Then he looked up at Miss Carlyle. Do you have a policy on student recordings? He asked. Miss Carlyle blinked, thrown off. Yes, it's prohibited. Judge Warren nodded once. So if a recording exists, he said calmly, it would mean students felt unsafe enough to document anyway. Mr. Grant's voice went tight. There is no recording. Keisha's voice was quiet. Are you sure? Mr. Grant's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time he looked afraid. Not of her, of proof. Miss Carlyle's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the papers in front of her. Your Honor, I don't know what you think you received. Judge Warren's tone stayed even. I think I received evidence that should have been preserved and reviewed before you tried to discipline my daughter. Mr. Grant stood again, voice rising. This is illegal. This is... Judge Warren's eyes locked on him. Sit down, he said again, firmer this time. Mr. Grant's breath hitched. Then he sat. Keisha stared at the table, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her face stayed controlled. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Miss Carlyle swallowed. What do you want? She asked, voice smaller now. Judge Warren held his phone in one hand, the other resting calmly on the table. I want a formal investigation, not a closed hearing, not a disciplinary rewrite, a real investigation. Miss Carlyle whispered, That's above my authority. Judge Warren nodded. Then I suggest you contact the superintendent, he said. Mr. Grant shook his head rapidly. You can't do this. This is political. Judge Warren's voice stayed calm. This is documented, he corrected. Keisha felt that word settle into her chest like armor. Documented. Outside the auditorium, the school was still moving, bells were still ringing, students were still laughing in corners, but inside that room, the truth had finally found the kind of weight that couldn't be pushed aside with a smile and a euphemism. Miss Carlyle looked at Keisha, and there was something almost pleading now. Keisha, she said quietly, let's handle this with discretion. Keisha's voice was soft but unyielding. Discretion is how you hit it. Silence. Judge Warren stood, not abruptly, but with certainty. I will be contacting the appropriate offices, he said. If you attempt retaliation against any student who provided statements or evidence, that will be addressed as well. Mr. Grant's voice went tight. You threatened us. Judge Warren looked at him. I'm informing you, he said. Keisha felt something shift inside her, something that wasn't victory yet, but wasn't helplessness either. It was the realization that she had changed the rules of the room, and Mr. Grant knew it too.
He stared at it with a look that wasn't rage anymore. It was calculation. Because people like him don't stop when they're caught. They try to strike back when they think nobody's watching. And as the administrators began to scrambling, whispering, gathering papers, glancing at the door like they wanted to escape, Mr. Grant leaned toward Keisha, voice low enough that only she could hear. "This won't make you untouchable." Keisha didn't flinch. She looked at him steadily and replied in the same low tone, "It already made me seen."
The days after the hearing didn't feel like victory. They felt like weather. Heavy, unpredictable, charged with something that could break open at any moment. Brookhaven High moved differently around Keisha now. Not kinder, not softer, more careful. Teachers who used to ignore her suddenly smiled too wide. Administrators who never said her name suddenly said it with a delicate tone, like Keisha was something fragile they didn't want to touch because it might leave fingerprints. And that was how Keisha knew the system wasn't sorry. It was nervous. If you've ever watched people switch from dismissing you to tiptoeing around you once they realize you're not powerless, you understand the kind of anger that creates. Not loud anger, a colder kind, the kind that remembers. On the morning after the hearing, Keisha walked into first period and felt the class fall silent in little pieces. Not all at once, just enough to notice. Her footsteps sounded louder than they should have. She sat down, opened her notebook, and began writing as if nothing had changed. Because Keisha had learned something important. People who want you small feed off your reactions. So she gave them none. At lunch, Talia approached her slowly, like she was stepping toward an animal that might bolt. Keisha didn't look up from her tray. Talia stood there for a moment, holding her phone in her hand. "I sent it," Talia whispered. Keisha's eyes flicked up. Talia's face was pale. "I sent the video to your dad like I said, but, Keisha, I'm scared." Keisha stared at her for a long second. "You were scared before," Keisha said quietly. Talia swallowed. "I know. I messed up. My mom—" Keisha lifted a hand slightly, stopping the excuses. "Listen," Keisha said, voice calm. "If you're gonna do the right thing, don't do it halfway. If you get asked about it, tell the truth." Talia's eyes watered. "Are you mad at me?" Keisha looked at her, expression unreadable. "I was," she said. "Now I'm busy." Talia flinched like that hurt more than yelling would have. Then she nodded quickly and walked away. Keisha watched her go and felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Not forgiveness. Focus. Because Keisha understood what came next. Retaliation rarely arrives as violence when people know eyes are on them. It arrives as paperwork. It arrives as rumors. It arrives as policy. By third period, the first move landed. Keisha was called into the office again, this time not guidance, not Miss Carlisle's office, the main office. The secretary smiled too brightly, like she was trying to convince herself this was normal. "Keisha," she said, "they need you in Conference Room B." Conference Room B was where the school met with parents, where they apologized without using the word apologize, where they made problems disappear quietly. Keisha walked in and saw two unfamiliar faces at the table, a district representative and a woman with a laptop open, fingers resting lightly on the keys. Miss Carlisle was there too, sitting stiffly like she'd lost control of her own room. The district representative stood halfway. "Keisha Warren," he said, voice smooth. "Thank you for coming. I'm Mr. Hargrave from the district." Keisha sat without greeting. Mr. Hargrave smiled anyway. "We understand there has been a misunderstanding involving one of our teachers." Keisha's eyes narrowed slightly.
Misunderstanding. That word again. Mr. Hargrave continued, "We want to ensure you feel safe, supported, and heard." Keisha waited. Miss Carlyle wouldn't look at her. Mr. Hargrave leaned forward. "We'd like to offer a resolution." Keisha felt her stomach tighten. Resolution often meant silence in exchange for comfort. "What kind of resolution?" Keisha asked. Mr. Hargrave nodded toward the woman with the laptop. "This is Miss Fielding, counsel for the district." Counsel. Keisha kept her face still, but inside she felt it. Escalation. Miss Fielding smiled politely. "Keisha," she said, "this is not adversarial. We're simply here to ensure process is followed." Keisha nodded. "Process wasn't followed when my dress was torn." A brief pause. Mr. Hargrave recovered quickly. "We're addressing that," he said. "Mr. Grant has been placed on administrative leave pending review." Keisha felt no relief. Administrative leave was not accountability. It was often a vacation while the district figured out how to protect itself. Mr. Hargrave continued, "We also understand you've been collecting statements and involving other students." Keisha's eyes sharpened. "Witnesses." Mr. Hargrave smiled thinly. "Yes, witnesses." Miss Fielding's tone shifted gently, like she was speaking to a child. "Keisha, we're concerned about the environment this has created. Tension, hostility, rumors." Keisha stared at her. "The tension existed when he did it." Mr. Hargrave lifted his hand slightly. "We don't want you to feel pressured, so we're offering an alternative." Keisha didn't blink. "What alternative?" Miss Fielding spoke carefully. "We can transfer you to another classroom for the remainder of the semester. Different teacher, fresh start." Keisha's throat tightened. There it was. Move the victim. Keep the system intact. Keep the adults comfortable. Keep the building quiet. Keisha looked at Miss Carlyle. "You want me to leave?" she said softly. Miss Carlyle finally looked up. Her eyes were tired. "Keisha, it might be best." Keisha felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "No," she said. Miss Fielding blinked. "Keisha."
No, Keisha repeated. I'm not being relocated like I caused the problem. Mr. Hargrove's smile faded. Keisha, we're trying to protect you. Keisha's eyes didn't leave his face. You're trying to protect the district, she said. If you're listening right now, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen the system offer a fresh start that was really just a quiet way of pushing you out? Mr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. We can also offer counseling services, he said. Support. Keisha nodded once. I don't need support to forget. I need accountability to heal. Miss Fielding's fingers tapped lightly on her laptop. Keisha, you understand this situation could become public. Keisha held her gaze. It already should be. Mr. Hargrove leaned back, composure slipping slightly. We'd prefer to avoid media involvement. Keisha's voice stayed calm. So would I, if you had handled it. Silence spread across the room. Then the door opened. Judge Daniel Warren walked in without rushing, without apology, without needing permission. He took in the faces at the table and the laptop and the district badge on Mr. Hargrove's jacket in one glance. He sat beside Keisha, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. Good afternoon, he said. Mr. Hargrove stood quickly. Your Honor. Judge Warren held up a hand, polite. Today, I'm not here in court capacity. I'm here as a parent and as counsel for my child's rights. Miss Fielding's smile tightened. Judge Warren looked at Keisha. Did they offer to move you? Keisha nodded once. Judge Warren looked back at them. That's retaliation by displacement, he said calmly, even if you package it as support. Mr. Hargrove's voice rose slightly. It's not retaliation.
It's an attempt to minimize exposure, Judge Warren replied evenly, and it's not acceptable. Miss Fielding folded her hands. Judge Warren, we understand your concern, but we also must consider the school climate. Judge Warren's gaze stayed steady. The climate was harmed when a staff member used physical force on a student, not when a student documented it. Miss Carsile swallowed, face pale. Judge Warren continued. You placed Mr. Grant on leave. Good. Now what? Mr. Hargrove hesitated. We're investigating. Judge Warren nodded. A real investigation includes witness interviews, evidence preservation, and accountability measures. It does not include pressuring a student into silence. Miss Fielding's tone sharpened slightly. No one is pressuring her. Judge Warren's eyes turned colder, still calm. Then put in writing that Keisha will not face disciplinary action for reporting misconduct, and that no student witness will face retaliation for providing statements. Mr. Hargrove blinked. That's unusual. Judge Warren's voice remained even. So is tearing a student's dress. The words landed hard. Miss Fielding's fingers paused over the keyboard. Judge Warren added, also, we will not discuss resolutions that require Keisha to admit confusion or accept partial responsibility. That's not resolution, that's narrative control. Mr. Hargrove's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he realized the easy path was gone. Fine, we can draft something. Judge Warren nodded once. Good. Keisha sat silently, listening, watching, feeling something shift inside her, not because adults were finally doing the right thing, but because she had forced them into a corner where they had fewer choices. When the meeting ended, Keisha walked out with her father beside her. In the hallway, some teachers watched through cracked doors. Whispers followed. But Keisha didn't feel small anymore. Not because she'd won, because she knew how to protect herself now. The district's investigation moved faster than anyone expected, not because they suddenly cared, because evidence existed. Talia's viso, multiple witness statements, prior complaints. The record wasn't just thick, it was dangerous. 2 weeks later, Keisha came to school and found a new teacher in room 214, a substitute at first, then a permanent replacement. Mr. Grant's name was removed from the schedule. Students talked in low voices. Some celebrated quietly. Some acted like nothing happened. That was the part Keisha hated most, how quickly people returned to normal once the danger moved away from them. Keisha didn't return to normal. Normal had been destroyed the moment fabric tore and adults tried to rewrite it. One afternoon, Miss Carsile approached Keisha outside the library. She looked different, smaller, like someone had been forced to face things she'd spent years avoiding. Keisha? She said quietly. Keisha paused. Miss Carsile swallowed. I owe you an apology. Keisha didn't respond. Miss Carsile rushed on, voice thick. I handled it wrong. I believed him because it was easier, because I didn't want trouble, and you didn't deserve that. Keisha studied her. Miss Carsile's eyes were glossy. The district is taking action, she said. He's not coming back. Keisha waited, letting the silence stretch. Then she asked, what about the ones before me? Miss Carsile flinched. Keisha's voice stayed calm. The complaints you ignored, the kids you told to move on, are they getting apologies too? Miss Carsile's mouth opened and closed. I don't know. Keisha nodded once. That's the problem. And she walked away. If you're still listening, I want you to hold on to that question. What happens to the people before the one who finally gets believed? Because Keisha asked it, and she didn't drop it. She finished her civil rights project, but it became more than a grade. She expanded it, added prior cases, patterns, policy language, how attitude was used as a weapon, how dress code became a cover. Her father helped her format it, but he didn't write it for her. He taught her how to make it airtight. Keisha presented it to her class near the end of the semester, not in room 214, in the auditorium, with permission the district granted quickly once they realized saying no would look worse. Students filled seats, parents sat scattered in the back, teachers stood along the walls. Keisha walked onto the stage alone. The microphone was too tall, so she adjusted it without flinching. Then she looked out at the crowd and saw Talia in the third row, hands twisted together, eyes anxious. Keisha saw Miss Carsile near the back, arms crossed, face tense. Keisha saw her father sitting quietly in the aisle seat, posture relaxed, eyes steady. Keisha didn't smile. She began. She spoke about rights and reality, about the difference between policy and practice, about how discrimination often hides behind professionalism and tone and standards. She spoke about documentation, not because she liked paperwork, but because paper is what the system respected when it didn't respect people. She did not dramatize the incident. She did not describe it for shock. She stated it plainly, and that plainness hit harder than theatrics could. At the end, she closed her notebook. The room was silent. Keisha looked out at the crowd and said the last thing in a voice that didn't shake. They thought silence meant weakness. They didn't know I was listening. Then she stepped away from the microphone. No music swelled, no applause cue. For a second, the room stayed stunned. Then clapping began, slow at first, then louder. Keisha didn't bow. She simply walked off the stage and felt the weight of the past weeks settle differently now. Not as shame, as proof. On graduation day, Keisha stood in her cap and gown, waiting in line as names were called. The auditorium smelled like perfume, sweat, and flowers. I heard cheers for classmates, heard laughter, heard teachers mispronounce names and keep going anyway. When her name was called, Keisha Warren, she walked across the stage with steady steps. She took the diploma. She looked into the crowd and found her father. Judge Warren didn't stand. He didn't shout. He didn't make the moment about himself. He simply nodded once. That nod said everything. Later, outside under the bright sky, a woman Keisha didn't recognize approached her. "I'm sorry to bother you. My daughter, she was one of the ones who complained before, years ago. Nothing happened." Keisha's throat tightened. The woman's eyes filled. "Seeing you, it mattered," she whispered. "Thank you." Keisha held her gaze. "I'm sorry it took this long," Keisha said quietly. The woman nodded, wiping her face. Keisha watched her walk away and felt the truth of it settle. Justice was never perfect. Sometimes it arrived late, sometimes it arrived uneven, but it arrived more often when someone refused to let the record be rewritten. That night, Keisha sat at her desk at home, the manila folder open in front of her. It was thick now, filled with statements and notes and printed policies and emails. She didn't need it anymore, not for survival, but she kept it anyway. Because she'd learned something that would follow her into every room for the rest of her life. Your voice matters, but your record protects your voice when power tries to erase it. Before you go, I want you to answer one thing in the comments. Where were you watching from when you heard Keisha's story? And if you've ever had to document your truth because nobody wanted to believe it, say, "I've been there." Someone reading that might need to know they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories where truth doesn't just cry out, it stands up, subscribe, because the next one starts with a rule too, and ends with someone finally refusing to follow it.